and it's a great approach. So I've actually kind of changed my talk on the fly after listening to the introduction pieces, because when I came in here, I was intending to talk more about how you should be working more toward automation. But I think with the emphasis on transformation this morning, it's more appropriate to talk about the why. So I may have a little disconnect between some of the slides, but bear with me because I think there'll be some good information here. So I've got my contact information up there. The gist of this talk is that in the industry, over time, over history, we've spent a lot of time investing in extraordinarily detailed, long-running manual test scripts. So raise your hand if you have thousands of test scripts that you have very detailed in Excel or Word or text files. Nobody? Okay, a few. So these things in the past have been fine, and I think they've lent value to our processes. But I think as the industry itself is changing, we're understanding that those don't necessarily lend a lot of value over time. Uncle Bob Martin, Robert C. Martin, who is a prolific writer, speaker, and a very wise person in the software side, spends a lot of time with test automation, and he's working on test-driven development. He writes things at a very detailed level. And he made an interesting comment at a conference a month or two ago that talked about scripted manual tests are immoral. Now, if you don't know Uncle Bob Martin, that's kind of the handle that he goes by, he can be a bit hyperbolic and overblown. So this is kind of his style of speaking. I don't completely agree with this because there are some situations where we do need very detailed manual tests. For example, places of safety. You know, I'm sure that the people at NASA, despite using good pairwise tools, and they use great automation, there's some interesting stories that you can read about that, I can guarantee that they still have very specific test scripts, because if things don't get done right, things blow up, and this is generally not good outcome. So getting fired from Apple is bad enough, but things blowing up, lives are in jeopardy. So along the same way, medical devices. You know, testing of medical devices is extraordinarily critical. I'm a diabetic. I rely on medical devices to give me information about my health, and if something's wrong there, I could die. So this is rather critical, and I'm frankly quite thankful that somebody's probably running through big manual test scripts around that. But in many cases, I think we can find that manual test scripts don't bring us as much value as we think, because it's just simple, mindless repetition of things. And then the question is that bringing good value to the company? So over time, we've done plenty of these things, and that's been sort of the thinking. But as we start to look to change how we work and how we deliver software, we need to be focusing more and more on short feedback cycles. We need to be focusing more and more on what value are we delivering to the company, so it becomes more about the why of this. So if these long scripts that are just simple repetition, there's another impact here, and this is kind of an interesting thing that I think we as testers, we're humans, and we don't want to do just repetitious things that don't exercise our minds. And if I'm just running through the same 3,000 test cases, I'm not using my experience, I'm not using my skill. So why don't I look at take those, push them off to some form of automation, and then I can focus my skills on asking the bigger why questions, and I can push all of those decisions and those questions forward further on, so that I can focus more on automation taking care of regression and me using my skill for the act of testing, doing exploratory testing and things, but also, more importantly, pushing some of the questions up further into the process. So we'd had a number of comments from Laurent, for example, around the whole team approach. And I'll be talking more and more about that because I think this is critical. And if we can take and win back a lot of time that we're spending in these manual tests, then all of a sudden I'm freeing up the ability to have conversations before we start any work at all. So before we're actually building any code, when we start to, say, determine a feature, we as testers should be involved in the conversations there and asking value-based questions. Does this feature make sense? are we considering impacts to other areas? So before any work starts, we as testers, now that we've freed up some of our time, can be contributing things more efficiently early on. And that comes through the entire chain as well. So if automation is good, over time I've found that a number of testers seem to avoid automation. So, and I think there's some different reasons for this, but one of them is, in America we've got a term called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And this is actually fairly understandable, and one of the most common points that I see over many years of working with a lot of people in the testing industry is, oh, if you're doing automation, my job's in jeopardy, because my 3,000 manual test cases that I have, there's a machine that's going to be doing those. Something else that's very common is, I'm a non-technical person, so I don't know how to write software, I don't know how to write code. And we'll see that as we kind of go through the rest of this conversation, moving toward automation doesn't mean that you, as someone who's been a manual tester in the past, you don't necessarily have to sit down and write the code yourself. You should pair up with a developer, and we'll have some conversations about this. The other thing is, there's too much to learn. And if you've been used to executing manual test scripts over and over again, sometimes you're not necessarily thinking about the configuration or the environment that your system runs in. You're focused specifically on the functionality. But moving over toward automation all of a sudden now means that you need to understand at a high level, or sometimes a medium level, how a web page loads. You need to understand what the database server's doing, or your messaging systems. So you have to start, this can be really intimidating. There are a lot of moving parts in complex systems. So this is another piece of why people get nervous about or feel threatened about moving into automation. But the whole theme of this morning is transformation or change. And there's a wonderful quote from a United States general, Eric Shinseki, and he says, if you dislike change, you'll like obsolescence even more. So the point there is that if you're not open and willing and enthusiastic about adapting to change, you're going to be left behind anyway. So the point here that hopefully I'll be able to convince some of you of is that you shouldn't fear automation, but rather you should see it as a tool that frees you up to use your skills and your knowledge and your domain to add value to other spots in the process. So there's a very interesting kind of starting point that can kind of help inform and ease some of those fears. And that's the idea that automation checks things, whereas people test things. So this may seem like a very subtle differentiation, and Michael Bolton started writing about this back in 2009. It's the idea that a test script isn't smart. You're very specific with it, you tell exact conditions, and that's all it knows to do. But a human, a sapient tester, which is the phrase that he uses, knows how to test things. So as you're exercising the system, you're looking for things that were unexpected, that automation will never ever see. And the point is that the automation checks for regressions, and the bonus here, or pardon me, the whole point of this is they're fast, it's completely repeatable, and they're very specific. And so that's a really nice win. That's the whole point kind of in the past, us having very detailed manual test scripts. Perhaps, to me, the biggest benefit of automation is that we get fast feedback loop. So typically with big sets of manual test scripts, you wait until somewhat later in the development cycle before you start executing that. And that's simply because it takes time to get those written, and then you finally have to wait until enough of the system is built that you can start executing them. So you may be weeks or months into your development cycle before you start executing those manual scripts. But with automation, I can start building pieces of those tests, the checks, and get them done much earlier in the cycle. And I can have them running very frequently so that I'm getting constant feedback of these things that normally humans are having to run through. But there's a whole lot of things that they can't see, and this kind of gets back to that difference between automation checking things and humans testing things. And this, again, is a reason to not fear or be concerned about automation, but understand that it's a tool and an advantage that frees you up to do things better. So I want to talk about different types of test automation. You may not be familiar with that. So the first off is unit tests. And unit tests are a developer level test. And the idea is that they're very specific, they're very granular, and they check one little piece of the system. If you are familiar with software, then they're checking perhaps one little part of a method. And they're not checking like the database or web services. So they're extraordinarily fast. The next piece would be integration tests, and these are things that cross boundaries. So you might have an integration test that checks that a web service can indeed create a new user in the database. So you call the web service, and then you check that the database was updated. So these are slower, they're harder to write, they take much more time to run. And then finally is the functional test. So a user interface test. If you're familiar with QTP or WebDriver or Selenium IDE or Test Studio, the tool that I work with, these are things that will start up a browser, navigate it around, and these are intended to check a functional slice and variants thereof. So there's also performance and security. These are very specialized. Load testing, automated testing to ensure that there are security checks in place. And in any well-done project, you have a mix of all of these because they're all extraordinarily beneficial and they cover certain areas. So you need a mix of all of these. So before I get into kind of the collaboration and where testers really fit in, I want to come back to this point of how the tests get used, because that's important so that you understand that where they run. Developers usually work on unit tests as they're progressing through their day. They'll write a few tests, they'll do a little bit of work, they'll run all of the tests that they have locally, they'll check into source control. There may be a continuous integration server, and that's something that's responsible for when things are pushed to software, to source control. They'll do a build, and they'll run all of these tests automatically. So remember, what I said, one of the best advantages of automation is a quick feedback cycle. So if every time somebody checks in, we have 100 people on a project, and as they're checking things in, we can have unit tests running all the time, and this ensures that what somebody over here wrote didn't break another piece. So as a manual tester, seeing that, this is great because it cuts down the risk that I have to run through all of my manual tests again. So all types can also get run very regularly and on a scheduled basis. So you might have unit, integration, and functional tests that run overnight. And again, this is a short feedback cycle as compared to waiting 3 months down the road to run this huge suite of manual tests. I see failures and regressions and other breakages in a very short period. Okay, so now let's talk about the collaboration part. And this is really where we can focus on sort of the theme of the day, which is transformation. Typically, and in the past, we've been very stovepiped. And by stovepiped, I mean we have our developer section, we have our PMs, and the testers may be in a completely different area. And that's a problem because you have no communication there that's happening at all. So if we can focus on some tester collaboration earlier, then we can start to use our skills as testers and move away from some of those manual tests. And the idea would be something like this. We have a feature. You can call it an epic, you can call it a large feature. But when it comes time to discuss that work for the feature, before any code's written, before any design specs are done, before any UI markup is done, testers need to be involved in that conversation early. The whole goal of transforming how we as an industry work, not just testers, but as software, should be cutting waste, meaning spending time doing things that aren't valuable, focusing on value, and shortening feedback cycle, right? So cut waste, increase value, increase feedback cycle. So if we as testers can be involved in that early conversation, we can bring to light some of the things that we know more about the domain. We can start discussing with the developers, have you considered these other areas of the system that may be impacted? It may be something as simple as A tester understanding that customers are price sensitive, and if we're working on a sorting or display of lists of items, that maybe the default action here should not be sort alphabetically, but sort by price. These simple things that we can pass on early means that we're eliminating as much rework as possible. So this requires, in many environments, a bit of a change, because we have to let management and the rest of the team know we want to be involved in those discussions early. And the earlier that we can get that done, the fewer manual test cases we have to write, and then also we can start collaborating with the developers as well on very specific things. So some of the specific, so we've talked about the feature work. We've gotten our input in at that point. Now it comes time to actually do work. So we'll take a work item off. At that point, we should sit down with the developer in the same room at the same table, or via a Skype or a telephone call or something, and have a discussion with them to talk about test criteria. We as testers think very differently from developers. Developers tend to write very shallow or happy path tests. So I have a long history as a developer, and my idea of writing a few good unit tests would be, if these various values go through the system, I see these things that come out. As I started working with more and more testers, and as I moved into the testing arena, I started to realize that I was leaving large numbers of automated test cases out because I wasn't checking boundaries well enough. I wasn't checking for error handling. As a tester, we tend to bring a lot of different views to a project. So the idea of me as a tester talking with a developer and reminding them, you're not looking for negative values, you're not considering what would happen if this other system was down, or if somebody cut the power to the service center. And then as the developer, they start seeing that input. They have the conversations with you as a tester. Over time, they'll have a much better view of you as a tester, because quite frankly, we get a lot of tension, right, between developer community and testers. As testers, we tend to think the developers don't know what they're doing and they're writing bad code, and the developers think that we as testers are just evil people trying to slam them down. And in general, we're good humans, and none of that's true. The truth is somewhere in the middle. But if you can talk with them, the developers learn to write better tests early on, and you start to understand more about how the system works at a low level, and that informs you much better with how you can do better testing. So you as a tester help extend the coverage of those, right? So the developer might just normally be writing 3 or 4 value tests. You as a tester ensure they're writing more by using your knowledge. Automation is only part of the overall strategy, and that's something else I think that manual testers or less technical testers, and when I say less technical testers, I don't mean that in any insulting fashion, right? It's okay to not know how to write code. That's not where you've brought value to the team. But automation's only part of that, right? So the comment was made earlier referring to some other conversations about testing being dead. No, testing isn't dead, but it is dramatically changing. And if we as testers can get those conversations in much, much earlier, that collaboration becomes much more of a critical piece to the overall project success. And the idea is, again, that the whole team approach has serious benefits. We're looking at trying to cut the waste, focus on the value, and decrease the cycle time of things. So as testers, we're pessimists, and we can kind of add that different view to what developers may not be covering. Automation shouldn't be feared. Remember that automation checks, and it's just mindless regression checking or functional validation, but you as a tester are testing, and you are bringing your value in addition to what the automation is bringing. Automation frees up you to focus on the things that you do very well, and that's a really critical thing. So again, it's the idea that if we do want to focus on transformation, we need to change how we work, and we have to take the work that we're doing at the end of the cycle, and that tends to be a lot of work, and we do a lot of rework, and we need to push as much of that up to the front as possible. And to me, except in a very few cases, those manual test cases are not a good use of our time. It takes us a lot of time to write them. The instant anything in the system changes, we have to go update all of these manual test cases. And it just sucks, to me, it just sucks the morale out of a team as well. You're great testers. You have good heads on your shoulders. You're smart about things. Use that and leverage those values where they make sense. So I'm finishing up a little short here because I was trying to avoid so much talk about the mechanics of the testing, but instead focus more about the why it's important for us as testers to spend more time working with the rest of the team, specifically around automation. We bring our values to automated testing. We help the developers write better tests. As we learn more about systems, we can also get involved in writing automation, particularly at integration or functional test levels. So automation isn't something to be feared. Rather, view it as a tool, embrace it, because it frees you from a lot of that mundane, boring work and gives you time to focus on what you do best, which is use your brains. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim. That was fantastic. That was nice and quick. And we have some good time for question and answers. Maybe 2 to 3 questions. Okay. Yeah.
I would like to bring focus to the suggestion that you have made. Testers should work with developers and improve the automation coverage at the unit testing level. So whenever I hear this argument about testers should collaborate with developers in that phase of the SDLC, are you suggesting that the testers should pick up and write the automated tests with developers, or only the testers write the automated tests themselves, so that you free up the developers to do their work? Because once if you're going that way, what you end up in doing is the kind of bias, the kind of, I am a creator, I can't break my code. That bias will again, set in the testers as well. And with the lot of community of the testers here who work for services companies, where we have very stereotyped roles. I'm a black box tester, I'm a domain tester, I'm a functional tester, I'm a QTP guy. It's difficult to say, now go and write a Java code, TDD Java code. It's difficult for testers who work in this kind of a thing to collaborate. So, what are your views on this?
So what is a good level of collaboration at the root, right? So you have different roles, you have different personalities. I am a huge proponent of pairing 2 people working on any unit of work at any point that you can. My preference and the places where I've had the largest successes are when a tester will sit down with a developer and do work. Okay, now I say sit down, right? So it may be a services company and you may be separated, but the notion of sitting down side by side with somebody can mean physically sitting at the same terminal, the same computer system, and doing the work, or pairing up using something like JoinMe, GoToMeeting. We have technology to work with this. I've done remote pairing in any number of jobs over the last 5 years. So more specifically about the roles. We do have people that are in roles of, I only work functional tests, I only do performance testing. There is still value at having a functional tester pair up with a developer when they're writing functional tests. And I can give you some specific examples. Developers write the user interfaces in specific ways, and many times for developers who don't understand functional testing, they create the user interface in ways that are very difficult to automate. But as a functional tester, if I can pair up with the UI developer, and the UI developer sees the difficulty that I'm having getting automation around a particular set of features, they may be able to help out and alter the UI or suggest some alternatives to me as a tester that will help me work more effectively. So I'm talking there at the big feature, and down at the unit test level, yes, I still believe that a tester and a developer pair together, even working on code and unit testing, can bring great value, because I've seen that happen in my own environment. I've seen it with other organizations that I've worked with, and then friends of mine that work at various sized consulting companies. And please be clear, I'm not trying to pretend that it's magically easy, that just the simple act of you sitting down next to a developer will fix all of this immediately. As with any culture change, right, we're humans, we have biases. We as humans tend to not change very quickly. But if you start and you commit even to just a half hour a day of pairing up with someone, over time, I think you'll see some good benefits. So at every stage of testing and development, the more collaboration you can get between testers and developers to hit that whole team approach, it's proven out. If you look around, there's documentation and some metrics around benefits to this. It's not easy, but start the longest journey with one step, right?
Yes, any other? Okay, there's one last question.
Morning. My name is Srinivas and I represent CGI. I manage a team which is 100% automated, so we run regression suits. I must sound a little radical here, and maybe Mr. Srivatsan can chip in because it's more from a India delivery perspective. What I have observed is that from an Indian context, when I interview people and I meet with them, they're so gung-ho and so obsessed with automation that they sometimes forget the basic elements of testing. And so from where you come from, so that they are saying, their main objective is that, will my script run without interruption, right? They're least bothered about what is the outcome of what they're doing. So the radical thought that I have is, do we really call them testers? Do we really need to be calling them testers at all?
So would you repeat that last part, please? Because
so what I'm saying is, so if I have a QTP expert in the team and he's supposed to be called as a tester, an automation tester in this case, and all he's obsessed about is will his script, the automation script that is written, run without interruption?
So that's a great question. So I love automation because I think it's very neat to write a script and you see the user interface navigate around and things click and I can just sit there and kind of twiddle my thumbs and watch the system happen. And you, as automation people, regardless of whether it's UI, QTP, or down at the unit test level, we can get too focused on this one specific thing. Is my test script running is more important than everything else? And this is kind of coming back to taking a step back and talking about the value of the work that you're doing right now. And if someone's being more concerned about how well their script runs rather than is it adding value to the overall process, then that's a conversation that you have to have with the team as a whole. The automation's important, but it costs money to get automation done, particularly at the UI level. It's very expensive to do the first time and keep maintaining. The maintenance is actually even more costly. So to people who are just fixated on that one little piece, I think it's important to emphasize, why are we doing this piece of work? Why are you doing that script? And remember that when I ask you, why are you doing this, it's not you personally, it's what value does this add to the larger picture? So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. Hopefully it does a little bit. And if it doesn't, please find me afterwards.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for referring that. Again, Jim is available during the tea breaks as well. So Ness, Haribabu from Ness, to present a small token of our appreciation to everyone.